Hey, listeners. Today's episode is brought to you by Kind Bar. Kind is deeply committed to crafting food with real, recognizable ingredients, a disruptive notion that sparked the creation of a new, healthy snacking category. Kind is unapologetic in their efforts to challenge the status quo, to shift the food industry, and empower the community and our listeners to make better, more informed choices about their health. Kindness can be a transformative force for good, and that is why we are teaming up with Kind to bring our listeners 10% off or 15% off for military, teachers, students, first responders, doctors, and nurses. Go to podgo.co/kind. That's podgo.co/kind. Kind Bar, creating a kinder and healthier world, one act, one snack at a time. Welcome back, Inebri-arts. This is Andy, the Inebri-art podcast. And I've been a big fan of today's guest for quite a while, and it was just kind of a shot in the dark. I shot out an email, and he got back to me almost right away. So, Shag, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
So I got to say, I think I stumbled across your artwork because I'm a big fan of like the whole rock poster, Coop and Kozik and that sort of thing. And I think that's where I kind of discovered you first. But then you have a very weird, like retro stylistic style that I just found really exciting. And but you also have like a nerd flair too. You do like a lot of Star Wars, and I think you did a Guardians of the Galaxy piece. So how did you get to where you are? Like, where did you start? Have you always been kind of into the pop culture stuff? And
Yeah, well, it's interesting you talk about Kozik and Coop, because those guys, they were kind of the inspiration to me to start doing my own art. I had worked for about 8 years in the record industry as a graphic designer and illustrator. And at that time, Kozik and Coop were putting out those great rock posters. This is late 80s, early 90s.
Mhm.
And seeing those guys doing it, making a living, putting out their own art was like something I wanted to do myself. And because I had seen those guys work and knew that they could do it, that kind of gave me a little inspiration to do it myself.
So you said you're a graphic designer, and your stuff is very like colorful, but like masses a solid color. Do you do a lot of your work online, or do you paint on canvas? Like what is your
Well, originally everything was painted by hand first.
Mm-hmm.
I was inspired by like those attraction posters at Disneyland. You see the Haunted Mansion or Peter Pan or whatever, and those were silkscreen posters, and I wanted to paint kind of like a silkscreen. And I remember I couldn't afford to do silkscreen posters, so I thought, I'm going to try and paint and make it look as much like a silkscreen poster as I can. So that's kind of partly where that Shag look came from. It was just trying to copy the look of a silkscreen.
Yeah, it's always interesting. Like people will always be like, "Oh, your style or whatever," and you're like, "I don't really think I have one." Like, was there a point where you're like, because I feel like every artist starts by copying other artists.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at what point were you like, okay, this is my style, opposed to copying Disney?
Well, part of what I did in the record industry is I was really good at working in different styles.
Mm-hmm.
So if a label came to me and they said, "Hey, we want this to look like a Herb Alpert record from the early 60s or something," I could do something in that style. But on the side, I was kind of developing my own thing, which was also based on, previous art styles. It was based on sort of a cartoony advertising art look from the 50s and early 60s. but I hadn't seen anyone do anything with this look in the fine art world. So I've never been in a gallery where somebody was painting in that style. So my initial concept was maybe I could do actual paintings that hung on a wall in this sort of cartoony graphic design style. And that's where the Shag look came from.
Nice. And at what point did you kind of divorce yourself from like kind of the graphic design, or do you still do that?
No, I mean, I do graphic design. Like, I've got my own gallery, the Shag store in Palm Springs. And if, we're releasing a purse or something, I'll design the little hang tag that goes with it. So things like that, I do the graphic design for, but I don't do any graphic design outside of things like that.
And I see there's a giant tiki behind you. That's kind of like a recurring theme in a lot of your work. Like, I mean, I feel like it's part of that whole lowbrow movement, like tikis and hot rods. And but why do you personally connect with tikis?
Well, when I was 21, and could go to bars, I had a couple friends, and we loved going to what we called old man bars at the time, which were basically theme bars that were untouched since the 50s or 60s. It could be like a tiki bar, it could be like a nautical bar or something. And we loved searching these places out in LA and going to them and sitting there drinking with the other clientele, who were usually old men and old ladies. And our favorite were the tiki bars. So we look for every still existing tiki bar in LA and surrounding areas, and we'd seek those places out. And at that time, if you paid like an extra $5, you got to keep the tiki mug. And those tiki mugs would be like our souvenirs for a fun evening.
Yeah.
And that's how kind of I got into tiki and collecting tiki. I was first collecting the mugs, and then I noticed you could see them in thrift stores or at the flea market. So I started buying them there, and I kind of became a tiki collector.
It kind of becomes like an infection,
Yeah, it is. And when, my two friends that I was going to these bars with were also collecting tiki at the same time. So when other people that are collecting the same thing as you want a better collection. So you
of course, yeah,
dive deep into it, and that was kind of my dive into the world of tiki. And this is mid 1980s,
which is, I mean, I would assume is a lot harder now. I feel like this day and age with the internet, it's so much easier to find whatever it is you're looking for, whether it's tiki everything. And
at that time, I thought there were only 3 people on earth who liked tiki, me and my 2 friends. I'd never met anyone else who expressed any sort of interest in it. And then about late 80s, I was at the Rose Bowl flea market. I was walking down an aisle, and I saw a guy walking towards me, and he had all this silver jewelry on, necklace, bracelets, earrings, and it was all tiki.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Easter Island heads and Hawaiian tikis. And I actually stopped this guy, and I'm like, "Hey, do you like tiki?" It was like the first person I'd met outside of my 2 friends. And he's like, "Yeah, I like tiki. Do you like tiki?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Oh, well, we have this little group of people in LA that, we collect tiki, and we get together and we talk about it." And I remember just thinking, like, that sounds insane. There can't be people so interested in tiki that they actually have a club,
Yeah. That's so funny. Like, there's no actual tiki bars around here. I have a few friends in the industry who've like either thought about it or, kind of threatened to turn their bar into a tiki bar. I'm kind of jealous because if you have that ability just to go to one, I don't even think we have any like real theme bars.
Most of the theme bars in LA have closed down too.
Yeah.
There are a few remaining tiki bars. There's a cool nautical bar still in LA. But a lot of new tiki bars have sprung up. So they've, you have that choice as well.
Because I feel like around here, it's all craft beer. And I feel like a tiki bar is cocktail kind of heavy. So how did you start working on, or is it like, I know you did the Star Wars Cantina and you did the Guardians of the Galaxy one. Like, how did you start, involving that kind of, nerd culture into your work? Was it like a commission type thing, or was it just what you wanted to do?
Well, it's kind of weird because 23 years ago when I started painting, Star Wars was not an appropriate theme for artists to be painting. You know, like I never would have thought about doing a Star Wars painting 23 years ago. But I started working with Disney 2003. So it's that 17 years ago. And I did a lot of Disney artwork just because I liked it and I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
And I always set it up so Disney could only sell it at Disneyland. Like I didn't want it competing with my other artwork.
Right. Yeah.
And then, about 6 or 7 years ago, the person I worked with at Disney came to me and said, look, we just bought Star Wars, and the head of merchandising at Star Wars keeps asking if you're ever going to do any Star Wars things. And he thinks you should do the cantina, I'm like, why didn't I ever think of that? It's perfect. And it sucks that it wasn't my idea, but I knew it was a great idea, and I jumped on it. I said, yeah, absolutely. And it turned out to be just a really, really popular piece of artwork. Lucasfilm and Disney sold the hell out of it. And even to this day, my agent still gets emails from people like looking for that. Disney stopped selling it a couple of years ago because most of it was limited edition.
Right.
And Disney doesn't sell things forever, but people are still asking about that cantina piece.
It's like the perfect marriage between Star Wars and your artwork, because your artwork always kind of feels like, there's a party going on. And
yeah, exactly.
So, why do you kind of focus on like that kind of party atmosphere? Is that kind of intentional, or is that just what you like to work on? Or?
Yeah, I mean, my first paintings were all set in tiki bars. Mr. Huge Tiki nerd, starting to do my own art, and I'm like, I'm going to paint tiki bars. So that's a celebratory atmosphere as is, but also the fact that I was raised as a strict Mormon. I had a Mormon upbringing. Mormons don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't go to bars, they don't have sex till they're married. And so all of that was kind of forbidden fruit to me. And that was something that just attracted me once I got a little older and kind of left the religion. But I was still intrigued by the things I've been told I wasn't allowed to do. And that obviously was a huge impact on my artwork.
Oh, that's like if you want a kid to do something, tell them they're not supposed to. I mean,
yeah,
that's just, I feel like that's common knowledge now. I don't know about when we were kids, but
yeah, I have 2 kids, and actually, because my art was all about drinking and smoking. It's weird. As soon as I had a kid, I stopped painting people smoking in my paintings.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it always used to be a woman would always have a cigarette in her hand. She'd have a black gloved hand with a cigarette or something.
Yeah.
And then when I had kids, I was kind of like, I don't want my own kids to smoke. So, with a few exceptions, I stopped putting cigarettes in women's hands, but I still painted people drinking, you know, and I told my kids, look, I paint drinking a lot. I drink. I would prefer if you didn't drink until you were 21, just because studies say the older you are when you start drinking, the less likely you're going to have a problem with alcohol.
Right.
And as somebody who did have a problem with alcohol, I wanted to shield my kids from that and,
sure.
and try and get it so that they didn't have the same problems I did.
Yeah, it's a very weird time. My son is 18 and my daughter's 16. So kind of that, how do I advise them without being like a hypocrite, Yeah. And it's tough, because you want them to make good choices, but in the same aspect, you want them. Like the one thing I always tell them is like, please don't do anything that's going to end up on the news. Like you're going to make mistakes. Just don't be on the news.
Yeah.
And it's weird because, they start to, I love that they are so open to discuss things with me, but sometimes they'll, my daughter has a boyfriend and she's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And, he smoked weed. And I'm like, oh, man, like, I get it. He's like 16, but sometimes I just don't want to know.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure, my kids have gotten up to things that I don't want to know about.
Yeah.
That's part of being a parent. You just like, I see nothing. It's like,
There's a great bit on an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, and he's sitting his kids down. His kids are like, I don't know, 9 or something like that, real little. And he's like, you're gonna grow up and do things that we don't approve of, and it's really, really important that we never find out about them. And I'm like, that is really what being a parent is. I'm like, give me deniability.
If it stays to the point where it's under the radar and I never find out about it, then it's not a problem.
Exactly.
Once I find out about it, then it's probably
now it's an issue. Do your kids take an interest in art at all?
They were both artistic when they were younger, but neither one is pursuing it, which I'm perfectly fine with. It's weird sometimes when kids compete with their parents in the same industry. So I'm happy. Both my kids, my daughter's a pre-med student and my son's into computer coding and engineering and stuff. So they both went really, science and technology.
Yeah. My son's kind of leaning towards being a teacher. My daughter is getting into art, and it's been really interesting, this whole lockdown quarantine nonsense. I've had no interest in creating anything. And then a friend of mine had bought a house, and here in Massachusetts, illegal to sell a house with a diving board on the pool. So the previous owners had detached the diving board and kind of just stuck it behind the pool house. So when they found it, they're like, we don't want to put it on, but can you paint it and turn it into, a decoration piece for around the pool? And I was like, yeah, can I do it with Zoe? That's my daughter. I'm like, can I do it with Zoe? And they're like, yeah, we'd love that. And so it was really interesting to work with her, and it was less of working with my kid because she's 16 now. So she's making some actually smart choices, and it was like working with another artist, and it was really kind of brought my inspiration back.
That sounds really cool. Yeah, my daughter's named Zoe too.
Oh, no kidding.
She and I collaborated on a piece, I think, when she was 6. But
yeah, with a Y or no Y?
With a Y.
With a Y, okay. Mine has no Y, and she's very adamant about that.
Well, we discussed it, my wife and I, and we'd seen a few people named Zoe spelled the classic way without a Y, and most people called them Zoe. And so we were like, wait, we just want people to pronounce it the right way. Even though I wanted to name her Wednesday.
Wednesday? Nice.
And my wife wanted to name her Zoe. So we came to an agreement that if she was born on Wednesday, we'd call her Wednesday, and any other day of the week.
It was Zoe?
Zoe. So she was born on a Tuesday.
Damn it. You're so close.
One day. And my daughter comes to me every now and then, and she's like, I wish you'd name me Wednesday. I'm much more of a Wednesday than a Zoe. Well, you can change your name.
So I assume that comes from like the Addams Family?
Yeah. I mean, not specifically named after that, but I always thought that was a cool name. I like the day of the week names. Tuesday, there was an actress in the 60s, Tuesday Weld, who was really beautiful. Friday, for Robinson Crusoe.
So speaking of changing your names, you decided on Shag. Why Shag? Is that my daughter has she is interested in street art, so she has like her street art name. So like, why Shag?
Well, that stems from back when I was working in the record industry, actually. And one of the bands I was in was releasing a record, and I had done the album cover, and I thought it would seem unprofessional if people looked at the record and said, hey, the guitar player did the album cover. So I thought, I've got to come up with another name. And I was actually inspired by like Coop, who used sort of his name's Chris Cooper, but he used a sort of a memorable single word name as a name. Or the Piz, he was another kind of lowbrow artist back in that day. So I thought, I just need a simple name that's easy to remember. And so I took the SH from my first name, the last 2 letters, Josh, and stuck it to the AG from my last name, AGLE.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And that's where Shag came from. And I thought it's easy to remember. It kind of evokes a few different things. There's shag carpeting. There's, shagging like in the UK, a euphemism for having sex, and so I thought, that's kind of a cool name, and people do remember it. It's
easy. Yeah. It sticks out. And that was the thing, is like, I always so my ex-wife is a big fan of the double middle name, and I was like, middle names are pointless. There's no reason for them. And so when my daughter was being born, she wanted to name the middle name Olivia Rose. And I'm like, I'm in. And she's like, that I figured you would be opposed to that. I'm like, no, because it spells Zord. And I'm like, that's perfect. And so I'm like, maybe that would be like a art name somewhere down the line. And she went in a completely different direction, but
What's her art name?
Scoot. And I think it's just like a friend thing. I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but so.
Yeah. I mean, I know several street artists, and a lot of times it's like, I either remember their street name or I remember their real name, but I have a hard time
combining the two. Yeah. See, I tend to give people nicknames, so like things like Scoot and Shag and my producer editor for the podcast Fish, to the point where if you call him by his real name, no one knows who you're talking about. It's I don't know whether it's a Irish Catholic thing, because all my aunts and uncles had nicknames, and but so have you always lived in California? Because I feel like if I had to describe your work, it's stylized retro and kind of like a surf feel kind of to it. So it feels very Californian. So is that something that's rooted in you?
Well, I actually spent the first 8 years of my life in Hawaii, which goes back to the tiki thing a little bit.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sure there was a subconscious thing of tiki and Polynesia rubbing off on me, which is why I fell into it so strongly when I was in my 20s. But for the most part, it's been California, Southern California. And, even now I live close to the beach. I go surfing or stand-up paddling 3 times a week. But I also spend a lot of time in Palm Springs, which is about two hours from where I live. Well, I have a house in Palm Springs too, but I don't live there.
So it's all warm weather.
Yeah.
Oh, so how are things there with the fires? Are they out? I've intentionally been avoiding the news, so I can't say much.
At the moment, there are no fires, no big fires in Southern California.
Yeah.
This year, it seems like Northern California got hit harder, but we have had them. I live kind of in a wooded area in the hills, and we were evacuated 3 years ago, I think, in October. So almost 3 years ago today, because a fire was heading our way, which is kind of an eye opener. It makes you reassess a lot of things about your life. And I'm sure we'll be evacuated again at some point. I just hope my house and studio don't burn down.
Oh yeah. I mean, to me, that's your family is going to be safe. What is it that you take with you, kind of?
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to make that decision. You have to pack your cars with everything, everything that'll fit and everything that's important, and figure out what those things are. I had, my wife and I and my daughter all packed our cars. My son wasn't driving at the time. We filled them full of
Tikis?
As much as we could, because, computers and family photos. And I have some fine art in this house that has value. I put that in the cars. Some of the things I was working on, paintings and stuff I was working on.
Yeah.
And then we drove to our friend's house, and then my wife was like, remember that container we packed with all the birth certificates and social security cards and everything? And I'm like, yeah, we forgot that.
Of course, Yeah, but I got the cool stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I would do. So this is an interesting thing. So you said you have fine art in your house that has value that you packed, and some of the things you're working on. I tend to find artists are the ones who value their own work the least. Do you feel that's true?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I took the things I was working on because I'd already invested hours into painting them, and I didn't want to start over.
Right.
But it wasn't because I thought, oh, this is a valuable thing. Some artists, there are two categories. The artists who have, like me, once it's done, I'm like, send it out, send it to the gallery, sell it. I don't need to ever see it again. And then other artists who are really emotionally attached to their work and just hate to see it leave their studio. which is an odd way to be an artist to me, because I do art because I want it to be out there and as many people to see it as possible.
Yeah. I had kind of a similar experience. I've worked twice on a public art display here in Plymouth, where they have like these fiberglass statues painted by different artists, and I found once it was up and on display that I was kind of like, it'd be cool to drive by and see people standing with it or taking photos. Like that's where I got a kick out of it. But if it got damaged, I mean, mine was like on the water. It got damaged, or people would pose with it and bend the base, or something would snap off of it or whatever. I really didn't care. Like, to me, it was like that. Well, that's part of it. It's going to be out amongst the people.
How I am. I had heard that one of my big paintings was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, it existed for a period of time and now it doesn't exist, Yeah. And it was taken out in Hurricane Katrina.
Especially now, because I mean, pretty much everything we create, there's at least a digital record of it. Yeah. So it's not like something that's lost to antiquity that's never going to be seen again.
Yeah.
Now it's a good story. Who was it? I'm going to blank on his name. He played Biff Tannen in Back to the Future.
Oh yeah.
He's an artist and did like a lot of Disney paintings.
Oh really?
Yeah, and like old toys and stuff like that. His stuff's really interesting.
I heard he's a really nice guy in real life.
I heard a podcast with him. He seemed nice, but that could still be an act. But I guess his stuff was in a gallery, and the gallery caught fire, and like they were rushing his paintings out into the street. I don't know if they all got saved. I'd have to look back into it, but it was an interesting.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I want to look that up.
Yeah, but in like one of the paintings that he did that caught my attention the most was he did this really cool painting of the Dumbo cars from the Flying Dumbo ride, and that's one I was. Let me get this right. Disney World is in Florida. So I've been to Disney World, and that was kind of like one of the memories from my childhood that stuck with me. But do you get to spend a lot of time at Disney because you worked for them or work with them?
Yeah, I used to, when my kids were younger, I spent more time there. Obviously, we had annual passes, and it's pretty close to where my studio is. So we'd go there, maybe 10, 11 times a year, actually.
Yeah.
But then my kids lost interest. Once they were teenagers, it was kind of like, I'd be like, hey, kids, you want to go to Disneyland? They'd be like, oh, okay.
It'll come back.
Yeah, I go there for meetings and stuff a lot.
It's interesting. I feel like I've heard from a lot of people that Disneyland almost seems different. Like people like to go all the time, and people who live in the area go to it frequently. And I feel like Disney World is more a destination. And
yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I've talked to people who work at Disney who say that Disneyland has this cult of devoted followers who live close enough to go there many times a year.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people at Disney World, they're flying or driving in, they're staying at a hotel, they're going to be there for a week, and then they're gone.
And it's in Florida, and I am not a fan of Florida.
I'm going to be completely political. I've had some great times in Florida. I used to hate Florida, but
last time I was there was July, and it was like 107% humidity. It was horrible.
Yeah, I've experienced some of that Florida humidity. California's like, I know people who've moved from California to Florida, and I'm always like, why? Like, California has everything Florida has except the humidity.
Yeah, I get the California thing where it's sunny and beautiful and warm. I'm a New Englander, like I get it. I want to wake up some morning to 3 feet of snow and have to shuffle my car out. I like that. But the Florida thing I don't get. I don't.
Well, last year I went to Boston in January, and I experienced the coldest cold I've ever experienced in my life.
And it wasn't bad last year. Last year was kind of nice.
It got down to 14 degrees, which I've never felt colder than 14 degrees.
Yeah. So. I always tell people the most fun is when we have lightning snow, because even New Englanders are like, yeah, that shouldn't happen.
What is lightning snow?
It's like thunder and lightning while it's snowing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's happened, I think, 3 times that I can remember. And it's unnerving because you're like, oh, this is like kind of end times things, and so
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, it's worth it, but like I said, it's just so strange that it's.
Yeah, it's weird. Last year I experienced the coldest I've ever experienced, and then this summer I experienced the hottest I've ever experienced. So I had to go out to Palm Springs, and it was 122 degrees.
Oh, jeez.
Which I think I've been out there when it was like 112.
Yeah.
I normally avoid it in the summer just because it's just too hot. But I had to go out for a meeting, and it was 122. And it's just like, you can't even describe it. You know, when you're like baking cookies and you open your oven.
Oh, yeah. And you get that burst of heat. Yeah.
That's what it feels like when you get out of your car. It's just like,
and you're wearing glasses, so you have that pain of like you walk out of the air-conditioned hotel to go to your car, and then you have to stand there for like 45 seconds to let your glasses accumulate or acclimate so they don't fog up.
Well, it's a super weak prescription, so I just put them on my forehead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, see, I can't see anything, so I need them. So you said you were traveling to Florida. Do you get to travel a lot now that?
Yeah, I've done a lot of traveling as an artist, fortunately. Less so in the last couple of years because the Shag store has kind of become the biggest public face of Shag, and it's not as necessary. You know, I used to, if any city or country wanted to give me a gallery show and would fly me out, I would say yes. And then over time, I got a little more selective. But yeah, I've had exhibitions in Europe, Asia, South America, North America. Still waiting for Africa. I've never done anything in Africa. Australia, I've done many, many things in Australia. And that's my second biggest market outside of the US.
Don't you feel that's kind of like a normal progression of success, though? Is like when you're starting off, you're like, I'll go anywhere for anything. And
yeah.
Then
when young artists ask me, like, can you give me any tips? My first tip is like, never say no to anything, It's like every opportunity that's offered to you, you have to say yes to it. And, you have to grab it and take hold. And my second piece of advice is keep your commitments. Because so many artists are notoriously flaky. So if there's some
Very
gallery,
much so, yeah.
Yeah. If there's a gallery and they're like, okay, we got these two artists we want to offer a show, and their work both sells the same. But this artist always, if we say have it here at the gallery on the 15th, they always have it here by the 15th. This artist, they get it here, but it's like 4 or 5 days late. They're going to pick the artist that's dependable. So, that'll give you a leg up over a lot of other artists if you're just dependable.
And even in a more commercial sense, like illustration wise, or I know a particular comic book artist jumps to mind. I won't name names, but who people love to bash his work, and to the point where they're like, how is he still even working? And I was talking to a friend of mine. He's like, because he hits his deadlines every single time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you can be the best artist in the world. If you can't make a deadline, who cares?
Yeah.
But I do love that don't say no to anything. And I was telling you before we started rolling that we started off as a drink and draw, and it somehow steamrolled out of control. And it was literally because people would come to me and they'd be like, hey, I have this idea. I'd be like, cool, let's do it. And I'm like, I haven't said it yet. I'm like, I don't care. Let's do it. If it's fun, let's go. And we kind of found this weird niche in Plymouth here where, the Chamber of Commerce reaches out to us and these charity organizations, and you're like, how did we get here? And they're like, because you say yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to go.
Yeah,
I got to the point where I can say no now and not feel guilty about it. There was a long time where I
did it get to the
started saying no to things, I'd always feel a bit guilty. God, should I have said yes to that?
Did it get to the point where you were feeling overwhelmed, so you had to start saying no?
Yes. Yeah. It got to the point where I was working so much, and I realized, I don't have to do everything. I can say yes to the good things and the big things and say no. I have such a hard time saying no myself, which is one of the reasons I still have an agent, because she says no. I can get her to say no, and it's like not me saying no. And there are two ways you can say no. You can say, no, I'm not interested, or you can say, yes, here's my fee. you know, which is, you just blow it up huge. And that's a way of saying no too. Or sometimes they'll actually go for it. And then you're like, well, I'm glad I said no that way, because
yeah, I know like a good friend of mine from high school started a flooring business, and he was getting busy, and he's like, if I didn't want to do a job, he's like, I would just name a crazy price, and sometimes they'd be like, yeah, sure, and he's like, suddenly I want to do the job. And
yeah, that's kind of how I feel.
Yeah. How do you, because I feel like there's another artist thing that people could use advice on. How do you set value on your work? Because I feel, especially starting off, people have a hard time either, especially very early on. I feel like artists don't feel they can charge for their art because, like, oh, I'm nobody, I shouldn't be charging for my art. So, like, how do you set a value, and when do you start to increase that price wise?
Well, my very first art show, which was one wall at a coffee house, and I set my own prices. And the most I could ever imagine paying for a piece of art myself was $300. So I priced the paintings at $200 and $300. And then when I got my first show at a legitimate gallery the next year, I told the gallery owner, well, I sell these for $200 or $300. And he's like, well, why don't we do $400 or $500?
Yeah.
Like, okay. And he sold the paintings. And then the next time I had a show, he's like, okay, we're going to raise these to like $800 and $1,000. And I remember thinking, like, I'm not sure people are going to buy them at that. He's like, no, I think they will. So for me, it was the galleries kind of setting the prices and raising the prices, because I was super, I was just chicken. I was like, okay, $400, that's the price of a Shag painting, And thank God I listened to the galleries, because the values have steadily increased. And then when I got my business partner at the Shag store, he came to me one day and he said, I have this plan. We're going to double our prices. And I remember thinking, what? It's like, here's the thing, you're not in the gallery every day. You don't see people come in and they'll say, how much is that print? That frame print. And I'll say, it's $2,000. And they'll say, okay. And he's like, I could have said it was $4,000 and they would have had the same reaction. So,
right.
Okay, go ahead. And I'm thinking, well, this is either going to be the end of the Shag store or it'll work. And he said, here's the thing. Nobody ever complains when the price of art goes up. People who bought that art 2 years ago and see that it's doubled in price, they're like,
are now going to be like, yes,
cool.
Yeah,
I hopped on at the right time. People who didn't buy it and saw that it's now twice as much are like, dang, I should have bought it back then. I'll have to hop on the next one. And he was right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Of the art world is it's all about money, not artists themselves, but galleries and museums. It always comes down to money, and they never talk about money either. That's like, they don't want to talk about money. They want to talk about everything else but money. But the truth is, it's about the money.
It's such a hard thing to do, because I think every artist really just wants to make what they want to make. But at the same aspect, if you're going to make a living at it, you have to make something that someone else is going to want to spend money on. And it's that kind of real trade-off.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you about my 2 pieces of advice for artists. And I have a third piece. It's more like when people ask me, what's the secret of your success or whatever. And the third one is, you just have to have stumbled upon some kind of art that people like.
Yeah.
There's no formula to it. There's no one that says, here's how to make art that people will like. You just have to make art that somehow connects to people and they really want it. And, there's no formula to that. It's just, maybe you're lucky. Maybe you're I don't know. And that's why I never actually give that piece of advice, because the artist,
because it can be kind of discouraging too.
Yeah.
Is there any like marketing? Because I mean, obviously you have a store, and I feel like if you go to art school, they don't really teach you on how to market your skills. I mean, they'll teach you everything you need, and maybe that's changed recently, but not when I was there. But there was no marketing class to be like, this is how you set up your portfolio correctly. This is how you sell yourself to a job, or. Yeah,
that's because the art schools, again, aren't talking about money ever. It's always about the art, and it's the concept, and it's you as an artist. I've heard there are some art schools that make you take one class in marketing or selling your art, but I've never come across it myself. So my thing was, early on when I started painting, I said, okay, I'm gonna join the gallery world.
Yeah.
And this is just kind of at the birth of the internet. And we were talking about Coop earlier, and Coop actually told me, like, after I'd had a couple of gallery shows, he said, like, why are you still showing in galleries? The gallery world's dead. Every artist has their own gallery. It's called the World Wide Web. And he's like, and that, when you're showing in your own gallery on the World Wide Web, you take 100% of the profits or 100% of the sales. And I'm like, well, that sounds good, but like, I'm a horrible salesman. So I'm just going to continue selling my art in the galleries. And it worked well for me. And I set down this rule, just this personal rule, where I would never sell anything myself. It always had to go through somebody else, another institution, or my agent. That way people couldn't go to me and just say, hey, can I buy something from you? And I would say, I don't have
I have $300.
Yeah. So that's worked for me, but things have turned around completely now. I mean, it's a great time to be an artist, because there's so many artists that have taken the whole thing into their hands. Instagram is their gallery. Mm-hmm. Etsy is their sales staff. There's 10 times as many artists today making a living from their art as there was 20 years ago when or 23 years ago when I started painting and putting art in galleries.
Yeah, and I mean, they're even doing some really cool stuff like live streaming while they work on something like Twitch, or doing demos on YouTube. It's just such a cool time. Yeah.
And I think it's great. I'm really happy that so many people are making a living doing their own art, and I would have had, I always think, man, I would have had a tough time if that's how it was when I started out, because I would be competing against 10 times as many artists as I was when I started painting.
Well, I think it's interesting that you kind of acknowledged you're like, okay, this is not my strong point selling it, so I'm going to have someone else do that. And I think that's it's smart, but it's also self-realizing that you're like, okay, I'm not good at this, so I'm not going to try.
I'd still be, if I had to sell my own art, I'd still be in that coffee house selling $300.
So you were saying earlier that you were in a band. Just before we get going, what are you listening to now? Is there anything that you listen to while you're painting or working?
I watch TV usually while I paint. I watch Netflix or Amazon Prime, mm-hmm. and you can only watch certain kinds of things when you're painting. So it's usually documentaries, or sometimes I listen to podcasts while I paint. I used to listen to music when I painted, and then years ago I just got tired of listening to music. Yeah. So I started watching TV.
What podcasts do you listen to?
I like This American Life, the mm-hmm. NPR one. I like Malcolm Gladwell has one called Unconventional History that I listen to. Kind of those general interest ones. Yeah. I don't listen to like political podcasts very much. Just I'm trying to take a break from politics. Like, is anything going on politically right now? I
don't know. I haven't heard anything. Intentionally, I haven't heard anything. My wife and daughter are like, just ears glued to the radio, to the news, and like every little change, and I'm just like, I am so sick of politics, and I was doing that for a while, man. I got burnt out. Like,
I'm totally burnt out on politics. I agree it's important, and then, I have kids and I want to see the future of this country. I remember when Obama was running, I really invested in, wanted him to be the candidate. And as soon as he was the candidate, I was like, okay, that's it. He's a politician. And I stopped listening to the news, and I took like a couple year break from listening to the news at all. And it was so peaceful, and so like I could focus on other things. So after this election, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take a break from the news and live my life without.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. I basically limit myself to, when I get up and I'm kind of doing my morning routine, I'll check the internet to see like what are the hot button news articles, and then I just go about my day because otherwise it's just too much. So so it's just not the best thing to do. So where can our listeners go to? Obviously, they can go to the Shag store, which was in Palm Springs.
Yes. And until recently, we had one in LA, which we shut down during the pandemic, and we're looking for a new location.
Okay. Hey, Massachusetts, wonderful place. But where can they go online to check out your current work?
Well, shag.com is a good starting place. If you want to see the most current stuff, my Instagram, I'm always posting new stuff on that. That's probably the place you can see the biggest variety of stuff. And my Instagram is the artist Shag.
Awesome. Well, again, I want to say thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a lot of fun.
I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Great questions too.
Oh, thank you. Not bad for coming up off the top of my head. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you guys again next week. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. You can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or on Instagram at Inebri-art6. You can email us at Inebri-art@yahoo.com. And make sure you listen to the other podcasts on the Inebri-art Podcast Network, including Bar Talk, Old Colony Cast, Retro Redoctopus, America's Hometown Horror Podcast, and our newest one, Theme Park Legends, a podcast about working at theme parks. What else? And we'll catch you again next time.